Hey everyone, my name is Ira, and in this video I will show you how to make this beautiful vintage inspired dress. I made this dress about a year ago and I absolutely love soft linen fabric, voluminous sleeves, full skirt, drawstrings across the bodice that gather the fabric, give it textured look, and also make the bodice adjustable. For this project, I will be making a few modifications. First, I will add drawstring to the shoulder seam to gather fabric even more, and I will be making a different kind of sleeve. This is the prototype that I've made. This is a full-length bishop sleeve with a very high cuff, finished with a drawstring, elastic above the elbow, and a slightly gathered cap. I think it will look great. It has this Victorian vibe that suits this dress very well. We'll see how it goes. Let's start by cutting out all the necessary pieces. I will be using this navy blue plain woven cotton made with the textured linen weave fabric, but you may also use linen. Make sure your fabric is light to medium weight and is not slippery. My favorite sewing related purchase is a projector. I open my patterns on my laptop and project pieces directly onto the fabric. No more taping and cutting digital patterns. If you purchase one of my patterns online, you can be sure it has a projector file. Transferring notes and sewing lines is much easier with a projector too. Here are all the pieces you will need to make this dress. Back bodice, front bodice, 2 mirror pieces, sleeve, 2 mirror pieces, sleeve cuff and sleeve facing, 2 pieces each, back facing, front facing, 2 mirror pieces, and multiple strips of fabric of varying length. Shoulder drawstring, 4 pieces, cuff ties, 2 pieces, bodice ties, cut 3 teeth, bodice channel, cut 2, cuff loops, cut 2 pieces. If you don't have enough fabric to cut them in one continuous strip, cut multiple tapes and then sew them right sides together, then press the seam open. With our pieces cut out, it's time to sew. First, I will sew all the ties, drawstrings, etc. As this dress has lots of them, the process is the same for all of them. Fold the drawstring piece in half lengthwise, with the right sides facing each other. Sew along the long open edge of the folded drawstring. If you want a narrow spaghetti drawstring, you may use a wider seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. Use a turning tool or a safety pin to carefully turn the fabric tube right side out through the open ends. Press. Now let's work on the bodice. Finish the shoulder edges and with right sides facing, sew the front and back shoulders together. Use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Press the seam open. Top stitch the seam allowance on each side to the front and back bodice, positioning it 3/8 of an inch away from the seam. This will be our channels for shoulder drawstrings. Now to thread the drawstring through the channel, you may use a loop turning tool or, as I'm showing here, attach a safety pin to each side and thread it through the channel. Now to the facing. I chose to use facing to finish the raw edges of the bodice. You can also use bias binding if you'd prefer. First, finish the edges, then place back and front facing pieces right sides together and sew shoulder seams. Press the seams open. With right sides together, place the facing on top of the bodice, match the center of the back facing to the center back and shoulder seams of the facing and bodice, align the long edge of the facing with the center front. Pin. Sew and trim seam allowance, understitch seam allowance to keep it from rolling outward. Never skip on understitching. Small things like this make all the difference for the finished garment. Stitch in the ditch along the shoulder seam to keep facing in place. Place front and back bodices right sides together and sew the sides. Now to the fun part. Let's add channels for the drawstring that will crinkle the bodice and give it this visual interest. Take a channel piece and fold the raw edges in towards the center, similar to creating bias tape, and give it a press. You may also use store-bought bias tape for this. Place the channel on top of the top line on the bodice. Align the center of the channel to the line. Pin in place, sew along each side as close to the edge of the channel as you can. Repeat the same steps for the bottom channel. This is what your bodice should look like at this point. Doesn't look like much, but that's because we still need to thread the drawstrings that will be giving it a proper fit. Now let's thread our drawstring through the channels. I will be using the same technique as with turning the drawstrings. I attach one safety pin to each end, pin one of them to the bodice, and thread the other one through the channel. This is a tedious part, but after some wiggling, the pin turns out on the other side of the channel. And there you have it, adjustable cinching at the bodice. Now what's left is to make sleeves, attach the skirt, and there will be another channel for drawstring in the skirt bodice seam that will cinch the bodice at the waist. This will create even more texture and visual interest. Now let's work on those bishop sleeves with high cuffs. First, you take the binding piece and iron all the edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. Place the sleeve facing on top of the sleeve, right side of the facing touching the wrong side of the sleeve. Refer to marks on the sleeve when positioning the facing. Pin. Sew along a sewing line marked on the facing piece. Using small scissors, cut along the cutting line close but not through the top of the stitching line. Turn facing to the right side of the sleeve and top stitch along the edges. Sew a gathering stitch 1/4 inch along the top sleeve cap cap between the gathering marks. Do not gather yet. Then fold in half right sides together and sew in seam. Now this is optional, but I find it looks very elegant if you add elastic above the elbow. Simply pin it along the line marked on the pattern and sew using a stretch stitch on your sewing machine, such as a zigzag stitch, maintaining a consistent stretch as you sew. Now let's add the cuff. Apply fusible interfacing to the wrong side of the cuff. Fold the cuff in half lengthwise wrong sides together. Press to create a memory fold. Fold one top edge under by 3/8 of an inch and press. Cut the loop string into 4 equal pieces. Fold the short string in half to create a loop. Position the loops evenly along the right side of the top half of the cuff, placing the first loop 1/2 below the folded edge. Pin the loops in place. Sew along the edge to keep the loops in place. Sew a gathering stitch 1/4 of an inch from the bottom of the sleeve. Gather to be the same width as the cuff. Align the raw edge of the cuff to the raw edge of the sleeve right sides together. Pin. Cuff should extend past the slit by 1/2 an inch at each end. Sew the cuff to the sleeve. Press the seam towards the cuff. Fold the cuff in half right sides together and sew the side raw edges together in line with the slit's edge. Clip the corners and turn the cuff right side out. Here's what it should look like. Now you can pin the folded edge just above the seam along that attached cuff to the sleeve and top stitch along the top sides and bottom edges of the cuff. Thread the cuff drawstring through the loops and tie. These sleeves are more complicated than what I would usually choose, but also add a touch of drama and elegance. If you choose to buy a pattern, there's an option to add a simple puff sleeve as well. The last step is to insert the sleeves into the bodice right sides together and sew around the armhole, and the top is done. This was the hard part. If you made it this far, you are my hero. Finally, let's finish off with a simple skirt. Skirt is basically a wide rectangular that will be gathered with a drawstring at the seam. Start by sewing the side seams of the front and back skirt. Then insert the bodice to the skirt and pin all the way around. Match the center front opening to the center front of the skirt. Don't overlap the bodice, but pin left and right edges of the opening without leaving a gap. Sew the bodice to the skirt, leaving a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now press the seam allowance towards the bodice and top stitch. This will be a channel for drawstring. Thread the drawstring through the hole at the center front. Give it a good press, put it on, and decide on the final length. Then don't forget to hem the bottom of the skirt. As a final touch, I've added beads to the drawstring to add weight and charm. And here's the final result, my friends. I'm absolutely thrilled with how this turned out. It captures everything I love about vintage fashion. Thank you all so much for joining me on this sewing journey. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more sewing inspiration. Until next time, happy sewing!